For 48 years, one door at Graceland remained completely shut. Not locked away because it was forgotten. Not sealed because nobody cared. Shut deliberately, carefully, and with a purpose that the Presley family never fully explained to the millions of fans who walked through that mansion every single year. Visitors could tour the jungle room, stand beside the gold records, and press their faces toward the velvet rope separating them from Elvis's most personal spaces. But that staircase, the one leading upward toward the private rooms above, was always blocked. Always off limits. And that simple fact turned an ordinary part of a house into one of the most talked about mysteries in music history. What was up there? That question followed every visitor who ever walked through Graceland's front door. Some imagined rooms frozen in time, exactly as Elvis had left them on the last morning of his life. Others whispered about objects too personal, too painful, or too revealing for public eyes. A few believed the family was protecting something far more significant than old furniture and forgotten clothes. And then there were those who took the mystery even further, insisting that the locked upper floor was connected to a truth about Elvis Presley that the official story had never dared to tell. Here is what makes this story different from everything you have heard before. In January 2025, that door reportedly moved for the first time in nearly 5 decades. And the people who stepped through it did not find what anyone expected. They found something quieter. Something more human. Something that changes the way you understand a man who spent his entire life being watched by the entire world, yet somehow managed to keep his most important pieces completely hidden. But to understand why what was found inside that attic matters so deeply, you first have to understand the man who put it there. Because Elvis Presley was not simply a performer who became famous. He was a person who built walls between himself and the world long before Graceland's upper floor was ever sealed. He learned early that the bigger his name became, the smaller his private life grew. And by the time he reached the final years of his life, the distance between the Elvis the public saw on stage and the Elvis who existed behind closed doors had become almost impossible to measure. That distance is exactly what was waiting inside that attic. And what it reveals about the king of rock and roll is more powerful than any conspiracy theory, any tabloid headline, or any shocking claim could ever be. To understand what was hidden behind that door, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of fame, not the first record or the first television appearance, but the beginning of the person. Elvis Aaron Presley was born on January 8, 1935, in a 2-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi. The house was so small that a single glance could take in nearly everything inside it. His family had almost nothing, and there were moments when having nothing at all seemed like a real possibility. His father, Vernon, worked whatever jobs he could find. His mother, Gladys, poured everything she had into her only surviving child, because Elvis had been born a twin, and his brother Jesse had not made it through that first night. That loss shaped the Presley family in ways that never fully healed. Gladys carried a grief that followed her quietly through every good moment that came afterward. And Elvis, who grew up knowing he had entered the world alongside someone who never got the chance to live it, carried that shadow too. People who knew him in his early years described a boy who was unusually sensitive, deeply attached to his mother, and already aware that the world could take things away without warning. That awareness never left him. It simply got buried beneath the fame, the music, and the enormous machinery of a career that would eventually consume nearly everything else. When the Presley family moved to Memphis in 1948, Elvis was 13 years old and already beginning to find his voice, literally and figuratively. Memphis was louder, faster, and more alive than anything he had known before. The music coming out of Beale Street was unlike anything playing on mainstream radio. The gospel poured out of church doors on Sunday mornings. Rhythm and blues moved through the neighborhoods after dark. Elvis absorbed all of it, standing at the edges of worlds that were not technically open to him, listening with the kind of attention that only someone who has spent a lifetime feeling slightly outside of everything can manage. By the time Sam Phillips at Sun Records heard him sing in 1954, something was already fully formed inside Elvis Presley that no amount of training could have created. It was not just the voice. It was the feeling behind the voice. The hunger, the tenderness, the barely contained electricity of a young man who had grown up with very little and was now standing at the edge of something enormous. Within 2 years, that something enormous would swallow the entire world. And Elvis, the sensitive boy from Tupelo who had never quite belonged anywhere, would suddenly belong to everyone. Belonging to everyone sounds like a gift. And in the beginning, Elvis treated it that way. He was generous with his time, his money, and his energy in ways that surprised even the people closest to him. He bought cars for strangers. He paid hospital bills for people he had never met. He called fans back personally when he heard they were going through something difficult. The young man from Tupelo who had grown up watching others have things he could only imagine never forgot what it felt like to need something and have nobody appear. So when he had the power to appear for others, he used it, quietly and repeatedly, in ways that rarely made the newspapers. But fame at the level Elvis experienced is not simply a condition. It is a pressure system. And pressure systems, when they build without release, eventually change the shape of everything they surround. By the early 1960s, Elvis was no longer just a singer. He was a brand, a symbol, a product being carefully managed by Colonel Tom Parker, the man who controlled nearly every professional decision Elvis made. Parker kept Elvis making movies instead of touring internationally. He kept him inside a system that generated enormous amounts of money while slowly narrowing the creative space Elvis had to work within. And Elvis, who had grown up deferring to authority figures out of both respect and necessity, largely went along with it. What happened inside that arrangement over the following decade is one of the saddest stories in music history, not because Elvis stopped being talented, but because the talent had fewer and fewer places to go. The movies became formulaic. The soundtrack albums replaced the kind of recording sessions where Elvis had once pushed himself towards something genuinely new. The spontaneity that had made his early work so electric was gradually smoothed away in favor of something safer, more predictable, and far more profitable for everyone involved except, perhaps, Elvis himself. The 1968 comeback special changed something. Standing in front of a live audience again, stripped of the Hollywood machinery, Elvis remembered what it felt like to perform without a safety net. The energy in that television studio was not manufactured. It was real, and it was desperate in a way that made it beautiful. People who watched that performance saw a man reconnecting with something he had almost lost, and the response was overwhelming. For a moment, it seemed like Elvis had found his way back to himself. But moments, no matter how powerful, do not automatically become permanent. The Vegas years that followed brought sold-out shows and enormous crowds, but they also brought a routine that gradually replaced inspiration with obligation. And inside that routine, something in Elvis Presley began to quietly disappear. The disappearing happened slowly enough that people close to him could almost convince themselves it was not happening at all. The schedule became stranger, the nights longer, the days more isolated. Graceland, which had once been filled with the noise of friends, family, and the controlled chaos of a life being lived at full speed, began to feel more like a fortress than a home. Elvis moved through it like a man trying to outrun something that had already caught him. The music was still there. The voice never left. But the person carrying that voice was becoming harder and harder to reach. The medications entered the picture gradually, prescribed by doctors who convinced themselves, or were convinced, that they were managing legitimate medical problems rather than accelerating a collapse. Dr. George Nichopoulos, the physician who became most closely associated with Elvis's final years, would later argue that his prescribing was an attempt to control a situation that would have been far worse without his involvement. The numbers, however, told a story that was difficult to reframe. In the final 8 months of Elvis's life, the prescriptions connected to his care reportedly included more than 10,000 individual doses. The mathematics of that figure are staggering no matter how generously you interpret the intentions behind it. What those numbers represented in human terms was a man in serious pain, physical and otherwise, reaching for relief in the only directions that seemed available to him. People who spent time with Elvis during those final years described someone who could still be warm, funny, generous, and fully present in flashes. But they also described long stretches where he seemed buried beneath something invisible, somewhere between the person he had been and a version of himself he no longer recognized. The weight gain that became so visible in his later performances was not vanity's failure. It was the physical signature of a body under sustained chemical and emotional stress. On August 16, 1977, the accumulation of everything finally became too much. Elvis Presley was found unresponsive in his bathroom at Graceland by his fiancée Ginger Alden, who had gone to check on him after the silence lasted too long. Emergency services arrived quickly. The efforts to save him were serious and sustained. None of it was enough. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Elvis Presley was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. He was 42 years old. The announcement traveled across the world in hours, and the grief that followed was unlike anything popular culture had produced before or has produced since. But here is what that grief left behind. Upstairs at Graceland, in the rooms where Elvis had spent his final hours, a door quietly closed. And for the next 48 years, it would not open again. That closed door became many things to many people over the decades that followed. To the Presley family, it was protection, a boundary drawn around memories too raw and too private to share with the millions of strangers who filed through Graceland every year wanting a piece of the man they had loved from a distance. To fans, it became a symbol of everything they would never fully know about Elvis Presley, the final locked room in a life that had always kept its most important truths just slightly out of reach. And to the people who believed Elvis had never really died, that sealed staircase was evidence, proof that something was being hidden, that the official story had gaps wide enough to build an entire alternative history inside. None of those interpretations fully prepared anyone for what was reportedly found when archivists finally entered the upper level of Graceland in January 2025. The space they encountered was not the neglected, dust-covered storage room that decades of imagination had constructed. It was preserved. The blackout curtains were still in place across the dormer windows. The air conditioning system had continued running, protecting the contents from the heat and humidity that would have destroyed them otherwise. And the boxes, dozens of them, were organized with a care that suggested someone had not simply stored these belongings but had deliberately curated them, arranged them as though they understood that what they were handling would one day matter enormously. The labels on those boxes told the story of an entire life in 5 or 6 words at a time. Tupelo 1945. Army Days. Hollywood. Comeback Special. Vegas. Each one represented a chapter of a journey that had taken a boy from a 2-room house in Mississippi to the most famous stages in the world. But the objects inside those boxes told a different story, a quieter one, about the person who had made that journey and what it had cost him along the way. A worn teddy bear connected to his childhood and his mother Gladys. A Bible from his military years, reinforced with tape, its pages filled with handwritten notes and personal markings. A leather jacket from the jailhouse rock era containing a handwritten message about the need to disappear when the weight of everything became too heavy. And then the recordings. Reel-to-reel tapes labeled Practice Sessions 1976, capturing Elvis's voice in its final year, unguarded and unproduced, singing without an audience or a stage or the protection of the enormous image he had spent his life constructing. One recording reportedly contained a version of Unchained Melody so stripped down and so human that everyone who heard it described the same reaction. Not shock. Not the sensation of a conspiracy finally unraveling. Something quieter and far more permanent than either of those things. The feeling of finally meeting someone you thought you already knew. That is the real discovery inside Elvis Presley's attic. Not a secret that rewrites history. Not proof of a disappearance or a cover-up or anything the tabloids spent decades promising was hidden behind that door. What was waiting up there was simply Elvis himself, the parts of him that fame could never quite reach, preserved carefully by people who understood that the most valuable things he left behind were never the ones the public had already seen. So after 48 years of wondering what was behind that door, perhaps the most honest answer is also the most unexpected one. Behind the door was a man. And somehow, after everything, that turns out to be more than enough. What do you think the recordings reveal about the real Elvis Presley? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you the way it moved us, there is another video on your screen right now that goes even deeper into the lives of the legends who shaped our world. Subscribe so you never miss what we uncover next.